The sauna was supposed to be a place of relaxation, a quiet refuge from the chaos of the family vacation, but instead, it had become a pressure cooker of tension and old resentment. I had barely settled onto the wooden bench, sweat already beading on my skin from the thick, humid air, when Daniel walked in. His usual cocky smirk plastered across his face, the kind that always made me want to punch him square in the jaw. I should have left right then and there. I should have known that being trapped in a small, sweltering space with my stepbrother could only lead to trouble. But the thought of giving him the satisfaction of running away made my blood boil hotter than the room itself. He sat across from me, stretching out lazily as if he owned the place. His sharp blue eyes locking onto mine with that same challenging glint they always carried, the one that had haunted me since the day our parents got married and forced us into an unwanted rivalry neither of us had signed up for. "Didn't think you could handle the heat," he said. His voice dripping with amusement as he leaned back, completely unbothered by the overwhelming warmth. "Figured you'd be out there sipping cucumber water with the rest of them." I rolled my eyes, already exhausted by his presence. "Not everything is a competition, Daniel. With you. It always is." There it was, that same relentless need to assert dominance, the same insufferable arrogance that had fueled every fight, every race, every test of endurance he had forced me into since we were teenagers. He didn't just want to win. He needed to, as if proving himself against me was the only thing that gave his life meaning. I exhaled slowly, refusing to take the bait, but he wasn't done yet. "You know," he continued, tapping his fingers against the wooden bench in a steady rhythm, "I heard Mom and Dad talking last night. Something about you not really fitting in. About how this whole family bonding trip was supposed to make you feel less like an outsider." My jaw clenched, my fingers curling into fists against my thighs, because of course, Daniel would weaponize my insecurities the moment we were alone. He thrived on it, fed off my reactions like a parasite, and I knew better than to give him the satisfaction. "You really can't help yourself, can you?" I muttered, forcing my voice to stay even. He smirked. "What can I say? I like watching you squirm." My skin burned, not just from the heat, but from the rage simmering beneath the surface, the kind of anger that had been building for years, the kind that made me want to wipe that smug look off his face once and for all. I refused to let him win, refused to let him see how deep his words cut, but then he did something that made my stomach drop. He reached over and turned the sauna dial up. The soft hum of the heater kicked in, sending another wave of suffocating heat rolling through the air, making my breath hitch in my throat. I stared at him, my pulse spiking. "What the hell are you doing?" His smirk widened. "Testing you." My heart pounded against my ribs, a mixture of anger and something else. Something darker, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "This isn't funny, Daniel. Then leave." His challenge hung heavy in the air between us, thick as the steam curling around our bodies. But I couldn't leave. Not now. Not when I knew that if I did, he'd never let me live it down. And that was exactly what he wanted.
The air in the sauna had become unbearable, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin like a heavy weight. But I refused to be the first to break. Even as my lungs begged for cooler air, even as my vision blurred at the edges. Daniel, on the other hand, sat perfectly still, his smirk unwavering. His body completely relaxed as if he wasn't affected at all, like he was built for this kind of torment, and maybe, in a way, he was. "Getting too hot for you," he taunted, his voice smooth, infuriatingly calm, while sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes, my breath coming shorter now, shallower, my body screaming for relief. I gritted my teeth, shaking my head, unwilling to give him what he wanted. But the truth was, I could feel my strength slipping, my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my muscles growing weaker with each second, and I knew I was reaching my limit. "You're insane," I rasped, leaning forward slightly, trying to ground myself, trying to push through the discomfort, but Daniel just chuckled, tilting his head, watching me like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "No," he murmured, "I just know how to win." He reached for the dial again, his fingers brushing against the knob, and my stomach twisted with a sharp, instinctive sense of panic. If he turned it up any higher, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stay conscious. "Don't," I snapped. My voice harsher than I intended, but Daniel only grinned, eyes glinting with something almost cruel. "What's the matter?" he asked mockingly. "Scared?" My skin burned, my body trembling from the combination of exhaustion and anger, but something in his expression unsettled me more than the heat itself. This wasn't just about pushing me, about proving his dominance. No, there was something else in his gaze, something deeper, something I couldn't quite place. And then, before I could react, he did it. He cranked the heat up to the maximum setting. The moment the sauna roared with intensified heat, my body reacted instantly. My lungs seized, my skin felt like it was on fire, and the room spun around me, the walls closing in, suffocating me in an unbearable, inescapable inferno. "Daniel!" I choked out, trying to push myself up, but my legs were weak, shaky, my head swimming with dizziness, and I stumbled, catching myself against the wooden bench, my pulse hammering wildly. But Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, watching, waiting, his smirk replaced by something unreadable. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered, his voice lower now, almost detached. "This isn't just a game to me." My breath hitched, the words striking something deep, something unsettling, and suddenly, I wasn't just fighting against the heat. I was fighting against him. What the hell are you talking about?" I wheezed, trying to focus, trying to stay upright, but my body wasn't listening, my vision blurring further, and for the first time, real fear clawed at my chest. "I could have had everything," he continued, his voice tight now, controlled, like he was holding something back. "But then you showed up. You ruined everything." The room tilted violently, my body swaying, and I realized this wasn't about the sauna, about endurance, about proving who was stronger. No, this was about something much bigger, something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years, waiting to explode. And now it had. "You've always been in my way," Daniel muttered, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. "And I'm sick of it." Panic surged through me, stronger than the heat, stronger than the exhaustion. I needed to get out now. I lunged for the door, but my limbs were sluggish, my body betraying me, and just as my fingers brushed against the handle, Daniel moved, fast, too fast, and suddenly he was there, blocking my way, his expression eerily calm. "Not yet," he murmured, and my stomach dropped. He wasn't letting me leave. He was going to let me pass out in here. He was going to win, no matter what it cost. My heart pounded against my ribs, my breathing ragged, desperate. I had seconds, maybe less, before I lost consciousness, before the heat swallowed me whole. My body screamed for oxygen, my mind hazy, slipping, but then, bang! The door to the sauna slammed open, and a rush of cool air hit me like a tidal wave, sending my body into shock, making my knees buckle. I barely registered the blur of movement, barely registered the shouts, the hands grabbing my arms, dragging me out into the open. The last thing I saw before my vision went black was Daniel, standing there in the doorway, staring down at me, not with victory, not with triumph, but with something else entirely. Regret.
Cold air hit my skin like a slap, shocking my senses as I gasped, my lungs greedily pulling in the oxygen I had been deprived of in the sweltering inferno. My body trembled, drenched in sweat, my limbs weak and unresponsive as I collapsed onto the cool tile floor just outside the sauna. Voices swirled around me, distant, frantic, but my mind was too sluggish to process them, too disoriented from the ordeal I had barely escaped. Strong hands gripped my arms, lifting me into a seated position, but it wasn't until I felt the ice-cold press of a damp towel against my face that reality started to solidify around me again. My stepmother knelt beside me, her face pale with shock, her hands trembling as she dabbed my forehead. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper, but I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at him. Daniel stood a few feet away, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable, but his eyes told a different story. There was something raw in them, something shaken, something he hadn't expected to feel. Regret, guilt, fear. I didn't know. But I knew one thing for certain. He hadn't expected me to make it out. And that realization made my stomach twist into a knot. What the hell were you thinking? My father's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. His face a mask of fury as he stepped toward Daniel, barely restraining himself. You locked him in there. He could have died. The weight of those words crashed down on everyone like a tidal wave, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in. The sauna wasn't just some prank, some twisted endurance test. It was a deliberate, calculated act, one that could have cost me my life. I could see the hesitation in Daniel's stance, the flicker of something close to panic flashing across his features before he buried it beneath that familiar mask of indifference. It was just a test, he muttered, his voice hollow, unconvincing. He could have left whenever he wanted. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it, my body shaking with exhaustion and disbelief. You're a liar, I spat, my voice hoarse, raw from the heat. You stood in front of the door. You wouldn't let me leave. A heavy silence fell over the room, the weight of my words settling over everyone like a thick fog. My father's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, and for the first time I saw Daniel tense, actually tense, like he knew deep down that he had gone too far this time. But it wasn't just about the sauna. It wasn't just about our rivalry. No, this was about something bigger, something deeper, something that had been building for years, and now, in this moment of raw vulnerability, I was finally beginning to see it. This isn't just about me, is it? I said, my voice quieter now but no less sharp. You've always hated me, resented me. Why? Because I exist. Daniel's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. 'Cause he knew I was right. And then my stepmother said something that made my blood run cold. Daniel, she whispered, her voice trembling, tell them the truth. My breath caught in my throat. The room suddenly felt smaller, suffocating in a different way now, a tension far heavier than the heat of the sauna. Daniel flinched, actually flinched, at her words, his gaze snapping to hers with something dangerously close to panic. And that's when I knew. There was a secret. A truth that had been buried for years. And I wasn't the only one who had almost died in that sauna. No, Daniel said, shaking his head, his voice low, almost pleading. Mom, don't. But it was too late. She turned to me, her eyes full of sorrow, of guilt, of something I couldn't yet name. It's not just you, she murmured, her hands twisting together. It's never been just you. She exhaled shakily, as if she had been carrying the weight of this secret for far too long. And then the words that changed everything. Daniel had a brother before you. The room spun again, but not from heat this time. My stomach twisted violently, my mind racing to piece together what I had just heard. What? I breathed, barely able to get the word out. Daniel's face was ashen now, his confident facade crumbling, his entire body rigid as if he were bracing for a blow he knew was coming. His name was Aaron, my stepmother continued, voice thick with emotion. They were inseparable until the accident. The word accident sent a sharp jolt of dread through my veins. The air in the room felt heavier now, as if time itself had slowed, as if the world had just tilted on its axis. My father's expression hardened, but he didn't stop her. He knew too. They had all known. Everyone had known but me. I told him to be careful, Daniel whispered suddenly. His voice eerily detached, his gaze distant, like he was reliving a memory that had haunted him for years. I told him not to push himself too hard. His eyes flickered to mine, and for the first time I saw it. Not just rivalry, not just resentment, but guilt. Guilt so deep it had festered inside him for years, poisoning everything between us. But he didn't listen, he murmured. And he drowned. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I couldn't breathe. The weight of this revelation pressed down on me with a force I wasn't prepared for, twisting everything I had ever believed about Daniel, about our rivalry, about us. This wasn't just about me being an intruder in his life. This was about who I had replaced. Aaron. I was never just a stepbrother to Daniel. I was a reminder of what he had lost. Replacement. The pieces clicked together one by one. The way he had always treated me like an intruder, the way he had pushed me, tested me, punished me. Because in his mind, I had taken Aaron's place. And now, in the sauna, he had tried to make me suffer like his brother had suffered. He wanted me to feel the helplessness, the panic, the fear. But he hadn't expected me to survive. A shudder ran through my body as I pushed myself to my feet, my limbs still weak, my heart hammering wildly in my chest. Daniel wouldn't look at me now, his head turned away, his hands trembling at his sides. He had spent years trying to make me pay for something I had no part in, something I had never even known about. And now I had to decide what to do with that truth. I could expose him, destroy him, rip apart this fragile, broken family with the weight of what I now knew. Or I could walk away. For the first time in my life, I saw Daniel not as my enemy, not as my tormentor, but as something else entirely. A boy who had never stopped grieving. A boy who had tried to turn me into a ghost. I took a slow, unsteady breath, forcing myself to meet his gaze one last time. And then I turned and walked away. Because some battles aren't worth fighting. And some ghosts will never stop haunting.